told him he absolutely should stay in Amsterdam no matter what happens. But he was running through the city like a chased dog. At some point he took off his Georgia star, the yellow star, and after 2 days, my daughter, my son, and I were picked up again during the night.
We're going to stop here and change the tape. We're going to stop. Ilse Hess. When we finished the last tape, you were telling us that you had just been arrested in Amsterdam after having been released from Westerbork. Can you pick up the story?
I told you that we were picked up again.
You had just been arrested in Amsterdam.
In Amsterdam,
yes.
Right. And we were taken to Westerbork again. I myself and the children. My husband was not there. I do not know, he was in the other building or in the Jewish Council. Anyhow, when we arrived in Westerbork, we had to stay again in line for the registration, and we were assigned some barrack where we could stay. I tried desperately to get word to my husband through some couriers which were going back and forth for the Germans to ask him not to follow me, to stay in Amsterdam. I couldn't say what to do because it would have been too dangerous, but he knew. We had hiding places. In fact, we had hiding places for ourselves. We had a hiding place for our children in a kind of a school for Dutch children whose parents worked in Indonesia, where they wouldn't most probably have been found out. And we had to pay for a fifth child that couldn't afford it. This were the rules and regulations of the underground, which we gladly did. We also this was all before being taken to Westerbork. We also were acquainted with a passeur. That is a person who takes you over the either Belgian or Swiss border. But this man wanted to make sure that we do not have Semitic features. My children would have to go to another place because no one took a family with children. It would have been too dangerous to keep 2 small children quiet and locked up in a room. That's the reason we had a special hiding ground for them. When the passeur came, he told the underground that he would take us. But I told him that I would not go with him, not even around the corner. He was from Indonesia and had only Semitic features. So unfortunately, we could not use any of these opportunities, and I wouldn't have done it anyhow. I would not have separated from my children, knowing that whole transports were going to Poland with children found in underground hiding places, without parents, without any grown-ups, and I just didn't want to. I figured if we have to perish, we perish together. that I asked my husband to stay in Amsterdam was for a different reason. He was a grown-up person who knew what he wanted, and he couldn't help me. But he didn't want to do it. He was running around in Amsterdam, friends later told me, completely without a head, and in the end he went to Austerfunden, who was the head of the Germans, the commander of Holland, and asked him to send him to Westerbork. And this man told him, "You must be absolutely crazy. Why would you do that?" He said, "Well, my wife is there and my children is there. My children are there, and I cannot stay here." So he gave him the permission to pick up everything from the cleaners and the shoemaker and take a suitcase along, and that he can go on a regular train. He doesn't have to go on a cattle car. So this was the smallest transport ever to go from Amsterdam to Westerbork. My husband and 2 volunteers. I never knew whether they were volunteers to go to the concert to Westerbork, or whether they were employees from either the Jewish Council or the Germans. So when my husband came, the children were very happy about it, and so was I. And we started our previous life again, trying to get something decent to eat, to take care of the children, and to work. Our biggest worry at that time was an outbreak of polio in Westerbork. And at one point, some of our doctors would visit the barracks of children who weren't feeling very well, and to see how their reflexes were. Well, my daughter didn't have any reflexes, and the doctors told me already that most probably she will have contracted polio. But it wasn't so. We were spared from this crippling disease, and after a few days she was all right. The other great worries we had that we would be put on some transport on Tuesdays to the east. At that time, no one knew anything about Bergen-Belsen. This name came only up at the end of 1943, because the war was coming to an end, and the Russians were coming to west, and few transports went to Auschwitz because the Russians had found the camp. So it was either Sobibor or Theresienstadt, and then we learned about Bergen-Belsen, that one transport would go to Bergen-Belsen in the beginning of February 1944. So we knew that our hour had come. We knew we couldn't stay in Westerbork. And we kind of volunteered to go on a train to Bergen-Belsen, although no one knew anything about it. And we really had to use our contacts in Westerbork to get on a train to Bergen-Belsen. My husband's instinct told him that Theresienstadt is too far, Sobibor is an extermination camp, and Bergen-Belsen, just in case we would survive, would be close to home. would be close to Hanover, Düsseldorf. It was a dream at that time. But in the end, not that we went to Hanover, but in the end, it was the only place where we had a little chance to survive. So we were slated and ordered to get everything ready for a February transport.
While you were in Westerbork, were you getting any news of the war? You said you knew that Sobibor was an
extermination. In Westerbork we got always news because Jews were constantly sent back and forth by the Germans to get papers and things in order, and they sent Jews back and forth. So we knew that it was the war was going purely, but we didn't have much time to waste.
And and you knew about the camps, the other camps?
No one talked about it. Let's say for months we didn't know that people were gassed in Auschwitz. Although all the train crew was Dutch, no one let on to anything. After a few months we knew that people were killed there, but not in how many and what happened to children and Mengele, and we didn't know anything about this. We knew more about Theresienstadt. The Germans flaunted this camp and the Jews talked about it, and it took there also a few months until we knew that families with children just didn't have a chance there.
Can you tell me about your trip to Bergen-Belsen?
Our trip to Bergen-Belsen started on a Tuesday. I think there were over 500 people who were taken to Bergen-Belsen. They were also partly cattle cars and partly dilapidated regular trains. Now I must say that any train I ever went on in these years, my husband right away was made a supervisor or a foreman or something. So the trip was pretty awful for the children, and we arrived on the 16th in Celle. It was a little past Celle. It was almost a private track, which was strictly the train station for Bergen-Belsen. We were greeted by SS and dogs and yelling, and people were crying, and it was a hellish situation. The camp was about 3 miles from this station, which I had to walk with the children. My husband had to stay behind to join some other men to take care of the luggage. That little bit we had to be saved. I do not know exactly how far I walked with the children, but it was endless, and at some point someone helped me to carry Stephen. At night when my husband came, we were still standing in icy cold to be registered. Later on I learned that the Germans didn't expect this transport and were not organized. Now we were taken right away to a quarantine camp because chickenpox had broken out in the camp. So we were taken quarantine, where we stayed about a month. We didn't have to work in commandos, but we had to keep the camp clean, had to go on a roundup every morning, an appel, at 9 o'clock, and had to do everything ourselves, whether you were old or sick, and were screamed at. Sometimes they had water, sometimes they didn't have water, but we still didn't suffer that much from hunger because we still had some reserves from Westerbork. I also bought from Westerbork a little sterno, this oven where I always could something, some coffee or some tea or a potato, prepare for the family. After 4 weeks, they closed the quarantine, at least for us, and we were taken to the regular camp and put into big barracks. There also, with also 700-800 people in the barracks. And the tone was completely different there. The men were right away divided into commandos, working commandos. You had to be at the appel place in the morning at 5 o'clock. And at 6 o'clock, the commandos left the camp for outside jobs. I realized the next day that the original inmates of this camp were Greek Jews. They were the remainder of a very large, very prominent Jewish congregation in Saloniki. And all the Jews there had been deported, except for a remainder that was sent to Bergen-Belsen. I think that must have been the Jewish Council of Saloniki. They never had experienced a concentration camp because until we came, it was more a detention camp. They had, if not good food, but they had enough food, and they didn't have to do the heaviest work. There must have been about 50 or so Greeks. In fact, the chief rabbi and his wife were there, Rabbi Kortek. So it was almost the same relationship as with the Dutch Jews. Now they didn't like the Dutch Jews and the German Jews because they would have to share with us the food, and they saw a different tone in the camp. We saw from the beginning that this was a camp of evil and misery. Not only was it dirty and very poorly taken care of, people were crowded together, there was no room. We had days and days without water, and people were beaten up. I remember that they had one commando that had to cut trees into pieces, and they only took Jews with a beard or who wore eyeglasses. And they were beaten and they were maltreated. And the only thing what they didn't were, they were not killed outright. Their way of handling the Jews was to work and to starve them to death. And it didn't take us very long to realize this. When I went on this appel place in the morning, I tried to dress myself as a very old woman, because women over 55 or 60 were kept in the camp to take care of the children, to clean the barracks, and the younger women were taken out into commandos. So I wore a scarf around my head. I looked gray and hardly dressed for anything. So they didn't really find me until maybe 2 or 3 weeks. Then I was picked out of the group and sent also to one of the commandos. Until then, for the first couple of weeks, I would have to clean the barracks and the washroom. There were washrooms. They were like beton or cement basins with some drips and drops of water. But sometimes there was just no water. And I saw in the camp that the only way you could get some food was to give up something what you brought along and exchanged it for food, because some of the men and women worked in the kitchen, and always, as bad as it was, had pretty much enough to eat. So they tried to smuggle, it was not allowed, some food out for their families. So sometimes you could exchange some things you ate, you had, like a scarf or anything, for a little more food. As I was saying in the beginning, before I was signed up for a commando, I helped carry the big pails with food. I was the only woman. I was strong, I was young, so 2 men or 3 men and 2 of these big pails had to be transported through the camp street, and it was heavy work. And after we had given out the food, some children and grown-ups were packed practically in these pails with their head and a spoon or their hands to get the thick of the pail, which was down in the pail. We always had to start with the doctors, who said they needed some more food to keep themselves healthy for their patients, which was a little bit of an excuse, but that's what they tried and usually got. Now, when I had to work in a commando, I had to give up this job and had also to be there in the morning roundup at 6 o'clock. And they assigned me to the shoe commando. I guess everyone has heard of this. It's interesting, my husband also was at one of the shoe commandos, but I don't even know where he was. It must have been so tremendous. These shoes, there were 800,000 pair of shoes from the German military, full of dirt, partly foul smelling, all of them. And they were collected to save the leather which you still could use. And that the Jews had to do. We had these inverted steel helmets on long tables. We each got a knife, and we had to cut these shoes apart. In some leather you could use, some leather was good, some leather had to be thrown out. We tried to throw out as much leather as possible, But there was no way to get through this mass of shoes. I sometimes think that they also had shoes there from people who were killed in Auschwitz, because maybe you saw in the museum these shoes, because there was ladies' shoes and children's shoes. It was a horrible job. And whatever these camps were outside the camp, and at little before 12, a whistle blew. That meant lunchtime. So we were marched out of the camp. I come back to this. We had a way of knowing what happened inside the camp while we were working. It was called IPA, IPA, Jewish Press Agency. I don't know how it worked, but it worked wonderful. Whatever happened inside the camp, we knew within 5 or 10 minutes. At one day, after weeks of having worked there, we heard in the camp that snipers had hit the camp, and one sniper had hit the barrack I was sleeping with my children. Come lunchtime, they told me at the gate back to the camp for lunch that the sniper had hit my barrack and that one person was dead and one critically wounded. My heart stopped. I don't know how I got back to the barrack, and I was received by an elderly woman who said, "You have terrible children. They don't listen. I don't know where they are." Well, my children were the only smart people in the barrack, because when they heard the plane and the sniper, they ran to this washroom and hid under the cement basins. And that saved most probably their lives, because when I came back into the barrack, a sniper had hit my pillow. And one woman, a night nurse, was dead, and another woman was critically wounded. At that point, I swore to myself, no matter what happens to me, I will not leave this camp again. I didn't have the slightest notion what I would do. The only thing was my resolve.
We're going to stop here and change the tape.